Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Nelson. I'm the Senior Director for the Center for International Media Assistance here at the National Endowment for Democracy. We want to welcome you today to this event on Internet governance and the future of news. The event today is part of an ongoing body of work that we've been doing here at CIMA and NED to build bridges between the media development world and the Internet governance world. We've got a lot of people here today from the technology and Internet governance community, and I want to just spend a couple of minutes explaining what we mean when we say media development. These two communities have really not worked as closely together as sometimes we wish, and at times have competed with each other for donor resources, and yet the importance of their working together could hardly be exaggerated. The Internet and Internet governance and the future of the news are really deeply intertwined. When we talk about media development, we're talking about a change process in the overall media system, and in particular the way the news and information is delivered to people and the way that news and information contributes to or impedes overall democracy and economic development. Media development not only involves journalists, but media enterprises, media laws and regulations, and the broad demand-side issues like whether the public and the political system really supports and demands independent journalism, and whether it trusts the news and media to provide high-quality news and information. Those are the questions that we are grappling with in the media development community, and we're trying to think about how international donors and supporters of high-quality independent news and news media can be more effective in their support to this overall process. So Internet governance is a big issue for the future of independent news and information. We know that the Internet has both made news and information more widely available and at the same time thrown a wrench into the advertising business model that used to produce quality journalism. There are also really serious questions about whether the Internet will over time prove a mechanism that continues to advance media freedoms, or whether it too will be captured by autocrats or short-sighted, self-promoting oligarchs who are transforming our world these days and using the Internet for disinformation and other campaigns that undermine democracy and the future of the systems that we've created in the world that we live in. So we have no choice but to get much more serious about Internet governance and to try to consider how we can try to make the Internet a place where high-quality journalism can survive. So we are really delighted that Article 19, one of our global partners in this field, agreed to work with us on this report and on today's event. And we're really happy with the way that the report that you will have seen on the outside as you came in, the way that has turned out. I think this report will provide a reference and a manual for people who care about these issues and who want to engage in these issues at the global level, also at the country level. And I hope it will build a pathway for an Internet that fosters free and independent journalism and that serves the interests of our societies. At this point, I want to introduce Niels ten Oever, who is the head of digital at Article 19. As a data scientist and scholar on these topics, he has been deeply involved in the issues we're discussing here today, training journalists, activists, and human rights defenders, and working on Internet governance, digital security, and media productions. We are really delighted he was able to join us for this event, and I'll turn it over to him so he will introduce our panel. Thanks, Niels.
Hello, everyone. I'm a bit curious to see how you self-identify. So who of you would self-identify as from the media development community? Don't be afraid. Okay. The internet governance and the tech community. And the others are donor community. Policy, general, democracy. Very good. So I feel a bit like I'm at the dinner where I'm introducing my family to the in-laws. And you know that can only go wrong. It's just waiting till the moment it's going to be awkward, and then hopefully we'll get over it and we can laugh about it and see how we can go forward. So I hope that will work out. So, but the way in which I can only think of bringing this together is to explain my own journey from media development into internet governance. Because my career started out with setting up community radio stations in Ethiopia, later radio stations in Somalia, mobile radio stations in Afghanistan, and then later developing a mobile app for reporting in Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and Iraq. And at that moment, I think, and this was a moment for many of us, it felt like everything was coming together during Occupy and the Arab Spring, where my personal theory of change was if there is freedom of expression and access to information, progressive social change and democracy will ensue. And that did not happen. So that brought me to go back and think like, what is missing? What did you miss in your analysis? What did you do wrong? And for me, what missed there was the critical point of organizing. So how do we build movements and accountability structures that are able to change the structures in which we work? And that's when I started to look at internet governance, where we're looking at new shapes of governance, where governments, civil society, and business are together shaping a global resource. And we are at a really interesting time where we see that the ICANN transition, the IANA transition, happened in which the US government gave away stewardship over a very important asset, namely stewardship of ICANN to the international internet community. So this was a sovereign state that voluntarily gave up control over something and handed over to a multi-stakeholder community. That is unprecedented in history. And how that's going to play out is only something we can see, but we do not only can sit back and see how it works, but we can actually engage in it. And I think that's the question on how and if we're going to do that. And the question, why should we do that? I think most of you know. Almost everything we do nowadays is mediated by the internet. Whether it's our relationship to the government, or whether it's our relation to love. We're messaging our partners, we're finding partners on Tinder, Grindr, Bumble, whatever. We are reading our news there. We're aggregating our news, we're opinionating, we're having our public debates there. And we're also doing our finances there. So it's all mediated via the internet. But what is the structure of what is the fabric that sets actually the way in which we think about that? Because the standards and the infrastructure do heavily impact the way we order reality. A more complicated way would be saying that the internet is a social technical assembly which is ordering reality. Or as Marshall McLuhan already said, the medium is the message. So we should strongly interrogate what are the powers at hand and what is this structure and how are we structuring our reality. So that is something that we've been trying to contribute to give a entrance in this field. And this is by no means an answer, because the beautiful thing of the internet is, and I think that's why we're also excited about it, it's not finished. It's just the beginning. So this means there's a lot of freedom, but there's also for us an obligation to protect it or transform it into a public rights-enabling sphere. And there are many different bodies in which this can be done. This is good because a distributed architecture of the internet makes it more difficult to control, but it also makes it much more difficult to coordinate. So there are many different places where you need to approach, and it's much harder to explain to people where actually something has gone wrong. Was it on the standards level, the application level? So who actually breached your data? Who can access your data? Through which jurisdictions is your data flowing? How does it even work? right? So that is something we even might have an obligation for ourselves as journalists, media developers, democracy people, to get acquainted with and to engage ourselves with. Because if we do not do it, other people might do it with different intentions. So to shine more light on this topic, I'd like to invite Dan O'Malley to the stage, who will introduce the panel for more discussion. So I hope you read it, and I hope to see you a lot in internet governance discussions. Thank you.
Is it on? Yep, great. I'm really excited to see everyone here. I'm Dan O'Malley. I'm the associate editor at CIMA. And one of the things that I've been doing over my past 2 years here is working on the intersection of internet governance and media development. I think both Mark and Niels have just made an excellent case for why this matters so much. And we're going to have a little chat today about some of the topics that we talk about in our report. And joining me on stage are one of my co-authors, Corinne Kath. She works for Article 19's Team Digital with Niels. She has worked on the technical, legal, and political aspects of internet governance for several years. She used to work as a policy advisor for a US congressman, so she's also familiar with Washington politics. And currently, she's pursuing a PhD at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. So we're really glad to have her here. Next is Sana Saleem. She is the community lead at Newsframes, which is a global voices initiative. She works on media research with a special focus on research methodologies and data analysis to explore the framing of news coverage and its possible effect upon audiences. She's also the co-founder of a Pakistani-based free speech group called Bolo Bhi. Did I get that right? Yeah. And a board member of the Courage Foundation and of the Global Network Initiative. And she has a background in journalism, which I think is something that we really will appreciate on this panel. And last but not least is Andreas Reventlow, who is the Program Development and Digital Freedom Advisor at International Media Support, which is a Copenhagen-based media development nonprofit. He works with local journalists and human rights defenders to promote professional journalism, digital security, and internet freedom, especially in countries where post-conflict and conflict countries. So we're very glad to have this panel. And I want to get this started with a question for you, Corinne, as a co-author. You know, I co-authored this, but I'm putting on my hat as moderator today. I think in the media development community, there's often been a tendency to focus on content, a belief that it's about producing quality content. If we get quality content, we'll get readers. Also, even in closed societies, that somehow that quality content will reach people. This report, I think, is saying something slightly different in the sense that it's saying it's not only about content, but there's also other layers to the internet that we need to pay attention to. So the software protocols that determine how information is transmitted, the hardware standards that determine how networks like the Internet of Things are organized, that these have really important effects on what the future of our media ecosystem will look like. And that's why in the report we talk about new web domains being discussed at ICANN, 5G cellular network standards being discussed at ITU. And so I just want to ask you to kind of maybe elaborate on why you think there needs to be a broadening of the sphere from the media development perspective in this regard.
Sure. I think some of the things that have already been touched upon earlier were the fact that there is a huge convergence. So people get access to the internet mostly via going online. There's very few people who solely rely on the sort of more traditional outlets, especially younger generation who use Snapchat to look at news. And I think taking all of this into consideration, it's simply not good enough anymore to say, like, if we can create really good content, we'll make sure that we have people actually reading it, because it's just not a given anymore. And then the question becomes, well, if people look towards the internet to get access to good media content, what is the infrastructure of the internet that lays below that? Because obviously the way that news gets spread will have an impact on who reads it and who sees it. And if you look even broader, for instance, something that I'm been working on for the last time is within the Internet Engineering Task Force, there's been a real push to make sure that there's a protocol which manages how you interact with different websites. And it's made initially such that when you enter information into a website, it's not encrypted. And that means that a third party can snoop on whatever you're feeding into that website. And now there's a real push there to make sure that that becomes encrypted, and that's happened through this protocol. And translating that to a media development situation, if you are a journalist working in under a repressive regime, and you're interested in information that isn't necessarily easily available, or if you try to gain that access to that information, it might have very serious repercussions for your security. Knowing that you can do that mediated through a safety protocol is extremely important. So if you are somewhere where you want to look up how internet filtering works in your own country, knowing that internet filtering and research internet filtering is illegal, then having these kind of protections in place are hugely beneficial. And that's sort of why I feel that it's important for the media development community to, take another leap and look at how the actual infrastructure of the internet can be made such that you also take these kind of considerations into account.
Great, thank you. Andreas, you work with a lot of local journalists, human rights defenders in conflict countries, some of the places that Corinne has kind of mentioned, authoritarian regimes. What is the general sense of those types of people when they think about kind of the topics that we cover in this report, internet governance? Is this something that for them seems really relevant day to day? Is it something that seems so distant? What do you think their reaction to this report would be?
Thank you. Without sort of thinking that I can speak on behalf of our partners or people on the ground, I think, having said that, I think there's this is probably a couple of steps removed from what is from what is perceived as important or relevant in a day-to-day context. I could see how that would certainly be the case. I think, and congratulations on the report. I'm one of the people who haven't written it, so I can say you should read it with no disclosure. I think tying into this, one of the central arguments that the report does speak about is the real world impact, if you will, of the implications that these sometimes fairly boring but very important things, the issues, the policies and the technology standards that are being developed have real world implications, but they are quite far removed from, I think there are probably more, let's say more in the sphere of internet freedom or digital rights that are closer to the everyday experience of human rights groups or media and journalism partners. We work in Syria, for example. That's our largest program. And a lot of what we do there has not much to do with journalism, but has more to do with the enabling environment or making the environment less hostile towards journalists who operate in and around Syria. And I think there, this report is, we have the obligation to invest in these areas that have a very profound implication over longer term, but while at the same time having that kind of rapid response mechanisms to journalists in Syria that are occupied simply by with staying alive or turning a profit if they can and so on. So I think it needs to go on different levels at the same time for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Sana, I want to ask you about because you have kind of a background in doing broader education about digital rights, about applying this to people's lives in Pakistan with your Bolo Bhi project and some of the television shows I think that you've helped produce. But you also have some experience, I understand, working with actual journalists and editors to talk to them about these issues in particular and why they're important. And I was wondering if you could, do you get a sense that journalists and editors are keyed in on these topics as much as they should be, are interested in it? What's your experience been in Pakistan?
Absolutely not. They're not. And I don't blame them. First of all, apologies if you can hear my tummy growl. I haven't had breakfast or lunch. And they said the mics are really sensitive. So about editors, I think I don't really blame them. And I'll pick up from what Andreas said. In the Global South, and also, I mean, I'll compare both. We often talk about the Global South when we talk about connectivity. But in the Global South, the problem is that there are far too many issues because these are developing countries. So there are issues such as poverty, there are issues such as, issues that come with the gender divide or others. So when we talk about the internet freedom, it's not seen as something that's a given. Because first of all, how many people actually have access to the internet? So it's from the get-go, it's seen as like an elitist thing because only a limited number of people have it. And then when it's already seen as an elitist thing, how do you explain to the larger population what it really means and how it impacts their life? So when you speak to an editor at a daily, which we constantly did, they are covering bombings, they are covering rapes, they are covering 10 other issues, and they want to know why it's so relevant that they should be covering internet censorship. So I'll just narrate an anecdote from one of the meetings. YouTube was blocked in Pakistan after a video caused quite a stir. And it was 2 years to the ban, and a lot of people did not want to talk about it or oppose it openly because the narrative that was being built by the government was that it's blocked for blasphemy. So anyone that commented about it being unblocked was directly being put in a position where they were supporting blasphemy. So when we were speaking to news reporters or editors, we wanted to help them frame stories such that you can address the issue of YouTube without talking about religion, because you can talk about YouTube as a platform and why it's important and why it's needed, or even the larger context of like ad hoc blocking. And we were in this meeting, and that it was like, yeah, I understand, we have our videos and it's okay, and like how can they block that one specific video and then leave it open? And I was like, okay, now I have to explain URL filtration and blocking to the editor. It's fine, I'll explain it to him. And I explained it to him, and he was like, yeah, that's fine, but... And then I was like, okay, how do I explain it in the context that he would relate to? And I sort of like came up with an example. Like in the 1980s, Pakistan underwent a lot of dictatorships, but one of the most horrific or the most repressive ones were under General Ziaul Haq. During the same time, Pakistan was engaged in the Soviet War, the Cold War. And General Ziaul Haq introduced a lot of media restrictions. And one of the things that all the editors remember, because they were all reporters at that time, was the fact that every time they would prepare a newspaper, it would have to go and get checked by the ministry or the ministry's men. And they would actually pick out stories that they did not want published. And so because they didn't have enough time to publish backup stories, and also as a means of defiance, they would send the newspaper and publish, and would actually get published with big blanks. So people would get these papers with big blanks where there's no news. So I said, that's how URL filtration would work. You would have big blanks on your website where they don't want you to see. So that's what essentially is like, what? And he called in 3 of his magazine editors in the room, and they're like, we're doing a whole spread on this, and we're going to talk about it. So, I mean, long story short, I think it's so important. I think as somebody with an experience in working in digital rights and also as a journalist, I think both people who work in digital rights, we have the responsibility to make it simpler or make it more appealing, or to explain it to journalists. And also as a journalist, I think I have the responsibility to be able to make these complex scenarios or these 10,000 acronyms that we hear at IGF much more simpler and approachable to people, because we need public participation, and all of these decisions happen without public participation. And the only way that it can be more open to the public is that it's through the media.
Mm-hmm. That's great, and that actually kind of brings me to the next topic that I wanted to discuss, which is multi-stakeholder internet governance in terms of talking about participation. Because one of the themes that comes out in this report is that there's this idea that multi-stakeholder governance, which is governance that includes representatives from the government, private sector, civil society, the technical communities, that when they participate on an equal footing, better policy decisions develop, and that there's more a broad-based support for these policies. And in general, that's where internet governance has been going since the creation of ICANN. Critics often will say that, well, it's actually a very bureaucratic, a lot of, like you said, the jargon, all the different acronyms that you have to remember, and that some of the power structures haven't really changed, you know, and that decisions are still being made largely by governments and the private sector. So I was wondering if you guys could speak about your different experiences with different internet governance forums and thinking about multi-stakeholderism in particular. What do you think the challenges are? What can we do to make it better? Are the critics right? Corinne, do you want to start?
I've had the pleasure of being able to participate in debates in all of the different organizations mentioned in the guide. Pleasure and pain at times. And I think one of the big things that's really important to remember is that multi-stakeholder governance is really different than anything we've had up until this point, to the extent that it really offers new opportunities for non-state and non-sort of corporate actors to get involved in making policies in a way that's unique, that's not been seen before, that you can just participate on an equal basis, that you can sit in on the meetings, that you can write policy just by the mere fact of deciding this is important to you and your organization and you're going to show up. That being said, I think there's a lot of merit in the point that you made, that governments and business actors still have a very strong influence. And that in part has to do with the fact that even though these debates and policy processes are essentially open, it's not always cheap and or accessible to participate. It takes a pretty good command of English. If you don't have that, it's very difficult to participate. And it's expensive because a lot of these meetings are sort of traveling circuses where it's in Brazil one year and in Swiss the next. If you're coming from somewhere global south, that isn't necessarily easy in terms of travel time, costs for hotels, visa, all of these things make it more difficult. So I think there's two things that are important to sort of retip the balance. And that is making sure that more civil society people become engaged, because right now you see that a lot of the important decisions are very much pushed by either states or corporate actors. And secondly, to make sure that there becomes more funding available to make sure that civil society people can do this. Because often, especially in the cases of companies, they just sit on a lot of money, and it's possible for them to come with large delegations. And at this point, that's not the case for civil society. And when it is multi-stakeholder governance, it means that the people who show up are the people who show up. So if civil society isn't there because they can't participate or they're not yet participating, you feel that in the end results that come out of these processes. So I think that's something that we really need to tackle.
I'll say stuff. Yeah, sure. I'm a huge fan of the theory of multi-stakeholder. I think it's a great, I think it's really, there are lofty goals in there that I think we can really strive for. And I think, no, very seriously, also in terms of internet governance, I think, it's still relatively sort of nascent or relatively speaking, recent in that sense. And so therefore, there's also a lot of stuff to still work on. And I think what you were saying is the two words that I always pick up on when it comes to multi-stakeholder governance is the equal footing or unequal footing, which I think is, equal partnerships, they don't just happen by themselves. It requires, civil society in this regard is almost by definition a weaker actor, at least in a market economy, right? I mean, we there are less resources, and that's often the complaint, and I think that's partly because it's true, and also partly because we keep complaining about the same stuff. But healthy, equal partnerships, if that is what we truly believe in terms of making multi-stakeholder models work and make them legitimate, the processes, the policy development and the technology standard development that happens in these environments, if they are to be slightly more representative of the communities that they also impact and have that legitimacy requires some sort of investment. And this will sound very Danish and socialist, but it requires some sort of redistribution in the sense that not only in terms of money, but also in terms of knowledge and trust and legitimacy that can also go both ways, really. And I think we can, I think it's also really healthy to take a long, hard look at ourselves in that sense and see what civil society, media development, journalists can offer. I mean, the report offers a number of really great areas where we clearly have an interest in engaging, but what do we also bring to the table, and what would other stakeholders benefit from having us at the table? I think that's and I don't have any of those answers, but I think that's that's one of the areas that we can really interrogate ourselves and see, are we only there to kind of demand accountability and transparency, or what do we have to bring? Obviously, the main benefit of engaging with media development and media is quality journalism and quality, the role that media normatively would play in society, and there's also something about trust and access and legitimacy in local environments that I think international development groups also offer to some extent. But I think those are some of the questions that we need to take a long, hard look at. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think criticism is necessary for the multi-stakeholder process or for anything in general. But I think it's more important to focus the criticism within the system, because what's the alternative to multi-stakeholderism, right? Not having multi-stakeholderism. So I think as much as the criticism is there, I would hope that we focus it more internally in terms of what the process looks like. And both my panelists rose important points about not the global south not being able to participate, the fact that the language is a barrier. And it takes me back to the point that I mentioned earlier, is I think that one of the questions that are raised, I think I can sort of answer it as somebody, as a brown person on the table, is that oftentimes what happens, it's human nature, right? Oftentimes you'd be on a table and when we talk about freedom of expression, when we're talking about media freedom, all well-meaning people, obviously, all friends and colleagues, they'll often tilt to the person who's on the global south to be like, hey, you talk about freedom of expression because this is an issue that impacts you a lot. And I think that attitude needs to change. And there are certain things that have happened within the United States as well that I think has caused that attitude to change recently, post-December. But I think that that's really important because they might not, while it's really important and always that there's more participation and more diverse participation, I think the onus shouldn't only be on people that are coming from the global south, because all governments anywhere are obviously hiding things. They always will. It's a power structure. All citizens everywhere should have access to information, whether it's a country such as Britain or US or in Europe or in Pakistan. So I think more accountability, more transparency, and also not taking things that people say authorities say on face value should be something that should be brought about, from everyone on the table. And we use the word sort of tainted the word allies a lot, but in the true sense of it, I think it's sort of really important, because you never know, even in the oldest democracies or well-established systems, even though those systems are better able to fight back dictatorial tendencies in even democratic leaders, but you never know when situations change and the structures that or the freedoms that we feel so proudly of can often seem like just concessions and not really something that applies to daily lives. I think I think my thing would be, and it always is, that when we are on the table, that the onus should not only be on people from the global south, and then we all should be better understanding, better equipping ourselves from the problems, because we don't know when our situation. And when I say our situation, the situation in the US or in Europe or in developed countries might be pretty similar to situations that other people are facing elsewhere as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I would agree that over the past maybe year, 2 years, there's been a kind of a growing understanding of the importance of media development based on kind of changes that have happened in the US and Europe. And so I think this is actually an opportunity for media development, because we're seeing that we need high quality information, and that's really important. People need to be able to get factual information. And this kind of segs into my next question, which is about, so if we understand that internet governance is really important for not just news online, but all types of media as it'll be transmitted through these digital platforms, there are a number of people from donor organizations, implementing organizations. What do you guys think this agenda would look like in terms of a project or a program level? What do these types of organizations need to be funding in order to kind of make this a reality? Andreas, I know you've thought a little bit about this, and I'm going to put you on the spot here since you're from IMS. But I mean, I think it's a difficult question, but I'd love to hear what you've thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the what you were starting off saying is that first of all, we need to when we're successful in terms of our funding, it is that we connect the dots, if you will. We try to break down the silos between funding towards freedom of expression and media, and broader, more lofty goals of good governance or rule of law and issues that are on the agenda, which we are a piece in the puzzle, if you will. And I think the same thing probably goes for internet governance as it's part of it's a piece in the puzzle of creating an enabling environment for issues that we really care about. I think that this report is super helpful in that sense, because it gives it gives us quite tangible examples of where we might make ourselves relevant, and where because these things requires they require hooks, or you require some way for us to say these are the priorities of funders, these are our priorities. This is how they translate or correspond to each other, right? So I mean, that was a very vague response to your very specific question.
No, that's actually great. Corinne, I know that you've also worked with some of these kind of capacity building projects, which is, I think, what a number of people have been doing, trying to build capacity of people from the developing countries, the global south, to be able to participate, to actually even just be able to go. And I think that's a first step. Is it enough? I mean, or is there more that we need to be doing? Is it just a matter of scaling those efforts up so that there is a more equal footing? What do you think?
I mean, I wish I could ever say it's enough, but it's never going to be enough. Especially because the thing about the ecosystem of internet governance is that it constantly changes. So while Article 19 is really happy to be able to do the work we're doing because of the work of because of the support we get from some of the donors in this meeting, we also see that the environment constantly changes. So because it's the internet, there's always new technologies that rise up. There's always new things we need to learn how to address. So it's a question, on the one hand, of scaling up the work we're doing, bringing in new, more diverse set of voices, because I think one of the big problems in internet governance is that it's very global north heavy, and it's very English speaking heavy, and depending on where you go, it's very man heavy. And that just means that there's a bunch of issues that we do not cover because the people who represent them or the people who understand them are not there for a variety of reasons. So I think that's one thing that really needs to be addressed going forward. And the second thing I think is that we need to be very willing to reevaluate what we do. Because what works now might not change or might not work in a couple of years from now because the internet governance sphere has changed. The bodies that we think that we've identified in this particular guide will probably still be there in 10 years from now, but their specific power role within the larger ecosystem might have changed, which means we need to be willing to update our strategies. So we need to try and move as fast as the whole system does. So I think it's that combination of making sure that there's more people and that we as civil society remain really innovative about how we go and approach these issues as they change.
Sana, do you have anything to add from a perspective of someone who...
So I think that we always, we very, and when I say I mean Bolo Bhi, I think we are very lucky in terms of like the funders that we have, because we have a very close and intimate relationship with the funders, and we always sort of have the kind of relationship where we're like, it's not only about providing financial aid, but if there are other organizations, because they sort of donors. As donors, you guys get sort of an aerial view of what people are working on in different environments, and you can see them sort of working towards the same goal. And sometimes their work, even when working not in collaboration with each other, is complementing their work. So our request has always been like, can you, because you're better able to see it than probably us, even on the ground, can you inform us of natural collaborations that we can have with individuals? And through some of that work, we've had collaborations with, let's say, media outlets, but it's limited to, say, digital security, why that's important and all of those things. But it's sort of like our foot in the door to like talk to journalists about why like things like internet governance are really important. For instance, even to explain HTTP and HTTPS, and even the fact that you want, not only are you going to communicate with sources, but if you're not aware of if the internet in itself or the infrastructure in the country is not secure, is not robust, the access is not available to people, you won't be able to tell the stories that are because you don't have access to them. And second of all, this is a time and place where every journalist wants stories and wants to promote whistleblowing and wants those sources, because governments are becoming more and more secretive, and they're deploying a lot of tools, and they have a lot of resources to become secretive. So in some ways, your only foot in the door for a story is whistleblowers. And how you will not get whistleblowers in an environment where governments behind closed doors are putting in more and more infrastructure to make sure that doesn't happen. So if you want that to happen, if you want to have a NSA story, if you want to have the Pulitzer Prize, you need to engage in these methods, because this is important. It's complicated, but it's really important. So with donors, I would say that I think that you have a perspective about different partners doing different things. I think that you should be sort of, I won't say marrying, that would be right. You should be introducing the partners more often, and also for unlikely things other than not just digital security, not just based on needs, but also based on the larger goal, because you have that sort of aerial view. And I think it's really important. And oftentimes we just have conversations with individuals and we figure out, hey, we can do this together. We didn't think that way. But it's important to have that. So I think donors should also be connectors. I know you already have a lot of work, but that could be one of those. Just an email could do. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. So it sounds like there's a broad agreement that capacity building still needs to increase, because we're not at anywhere the same, civil society is not anywhere at the same level as governments and the private sector, but that there also could be some work on kind of building broader networks, and perhaps broader networks among the media development community to help connect to these people and also make them realize why what they're working on connects with internet governance.
But all the governments are working together to spy on us. We should be working together too.
Right. and that actually, I have a question, because, that we've seen basically a global crackdown on freedom of expression online over the past couple of years. The Freedom House numbers have, the Freedom Index of Freedom on the Net numbers have been going down for 6 consecutive years. 2/3 of people around the world live in countries where if they criticize the government on a website or social media, that can be censored. Especially attacks on journalists, which are increasingly, increasingly through online means or surveillance that then actually has real-world, sometimes very grim consequences. So we're seeing, in some ways, there's a lot of bad things going on at the global level, in terms of also countries like, China trying to create a multilateral governance that would kind of exclude civil society from this type of participation, right? So in light of that, given these real immediate digital security needs that a lot of people have, how do we also make the case that multi-stakeholder internet governance is something that we should be focusing a lot of our energy on? What do you guys think about that? How do we balance this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one part, and this is something that we spoke about yesterday, and something I think that we can do much more of. So I think we've seen in the past couple of years, there's quite a lot of advocacy and very public attention towards things like blocking and filtering and shutdowns and all these things which happen on and this is where I show you that I've read the report. It happens on a both a social and a content layer of the internet, right? But when it comes to the logical layer and the infrastructural layer, which are issues that we really need to engage with, but which we have perhaps a more difficult time in showing what the implications are of policies and technology standards being developed and what the actual impact is or implication is. We need to, I think, make a more convincing narrative, basically, around what's going on and what the actual implications are. Because I think when it comes to, like, let's say the other layers of when it's digital security or access or blocking, there we've already made the case in to some extent, at least. I mean, I think that we're up to a large extent. We're also up against great powers that seek to control it, but some of these slightly more opaque implications, or where it's not quite clear what the implications of domain regulation or why is it actually important to have secure Wi-Fi standards, because some of our partners only connect to public Wi-Fi, and therefore making that case quite specifically and to highlight why that's actually relevant and why it isn't only about public attention and advocacy on digital security and the social and content layer of the internet, but also on the slightly more technical and slightly more long-term perspective of the internet. I think is.
I'm fortunate enough to be on this panel with someone who I think explains this really well, and that's Corinne. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about kind of some of the, because we've talked in the past about some of these standards that are being created sometimes for like IoT and how they can actually incorporate kind of surveillance technologies in them. And so this is a discussion that's happening at a very technical level. But if you think about the long term in terms of the safety of journalists, the safety of human rights activists, that's crucial. So I was wondering if you could talk about any kind of debate that's going on now and maybe some of Article 19's work in that area. Sure. And then after that, I'm going to start opening it up for questions. So if you have a question, prepare that.
I think if there's one thing that should sort of be brought to the fore from the report, it's that the internet is pretty much the infrastructure that mediates our digital public sphere. And so you can never sort of separate what that medium is from how the message gets delivered, because it is one and the same. So I gave the example already of HTTPS and making sure that is encrypted. And there's many other examples within the guide, but also, there was much more content we had that we could have included, because these discussions are across a broad range of organizations, and a lot of them are very important. But something else that I think is crucial at this point, for instance, is some of the work that's going on within the International Telecommunications Union, where there have always been pushes to integrate technology into standards that is essentially really bad because it tracks people. Now, for instance, if you're a journalist in Russia and you know that just using a certain technology means you constantly get tracked, that will, even if it doesn't have any sort of repercussions in the sense of you having to go to jail, it might mean that there's a chilling effect. So you are less likely to go look for certain information, or you are less likely to publish certain information. And these are all things that you can address by going to these bodies, participating in these debates, and saying, can you please look at that from our point of view? Can you look at what this means for a media developer or a journalist? And can we renegotiate? Can we see if it's possible to build this technology in a way that isn't so privacy invasive? And I operate from sort of the paradigm of, if this happens, I'd like to think that often it's stupidity over malevolence, but I increasingly see that is not the case. I increasingly see that certain actors are coming to these bodies with the intention of introducing technology that allows for surveillance and that makes freedom of expression harder. And I think that is really worrisome. And the problem is that a lot of people perceive these bodies to they're difficult. It's very technical. You need a certain basic understanding of how the internet works to be able to sort of function within them. But it's not impossible. I'm a political scientist by training, and yet I can have a conversation with a technical engineer in which at some point she or he will probably think, I don't entirely know what I'm talking about, but the point of view that I can bring is like, let me explain to you how human rights work, and let me explain to you how I've seen this impact our partners on the ground. And then they're like, oh, we hadn't even considered that. And I think that is sort of the crucial part of this, that there is so much going on that will fundamentally impact what good journalism can do and what it looks like. And we're not there to sort of bring that perspective, and that needs to change.
Yeah, great. Okay, so now I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. If you could please wait for the mic to come, and then please state your name and affiliation. And I think we're gonna, in a nod to gender parity, we're gonna try and go boy, girl, just to make sure that we have everything.
Or anybody who identifies as neither.
Or neither.
In between.
Yeah. So please raise your hands. Courtney Raj? Yeah.
My name is Courtney Raj. I'm with the Committee to Protect Journalists. 2 questions. So, Corinne, you said that more diverse voices are important because otherwise certain issues aren't there.
Yeah.
But if you look at the power dynamics in the multi-stakeholder fora, companies have a way to get on the same page, and you could argue that it's more powerful when you have groups of countries, groups of governments, and you have civil society all over the place. So could that not serve to actually dilute? And then the second question around journalists is, should we expect journalists themselves to be involved in internet governance, or can we depend on organizations that represent journalists? And could you talk a little bit about how to, you talked a little bit about internet censorship, but how do you get journalists interested in this as an issue of internet governance? I think you had a little bit of that when you framed it as, the internet will no longer be American, but that may have been more detrimental to our long-term goals, on freedom of expression and multi-stakeholderism. Thanks.
Sure. So I think I'll address the first point, and then maybe either one of you can also take up some of the additional questions. Yes, it is a problem that civil society is not as organized as some of the other actors. That being said, I think that bringing a more diverse perspective is really important. And let me give a very concrete example. The Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, I'm terribly sorry for the acronym SOUP, it's just something you can't seem to sort of evade in internet governance, up until recently did not have an anti-harassment policy. Because for a long time, the majority of the people there were the type that don't feel that that is necessary, i.e. white men. And ICANN has been diversifying over the years, which means that this has now become a thing that they realized, wow, this is important. We need this for our ability to function, and also to make sure that we do our work better. Because in that sense, I sort of see the multi-stakeholder model as open software. So more eyeballs means better software. More people there means better policy. That being said, I think we could do a lot more as civil society on coordination. At the same time, we also need to be, respectful of the fact that civil society doesn't always have the same goals, and that people from different regions want different things. And that is precisely what the multi-stakeholder model enables, even if as sort of a block, it doesn't always make us equally impactful. But at the same time, that holds for governments too. That holds for businesses as well. They don't always see eye to eye or walk together as one cohort in the same direction. So in that sense, I think diversity and inclusivity, when it's combined, is the way forward.
Yeah, to your second question, I think it's really important to humanize what internet governance means, and why, for instance, HTTP or HTTPS is where those decisions were made, and even your examples with the ITU, I think it's very important to humanize them. I think in some way responsibility does lie not only on organizations that represent journalists, but also organizations like digital security or digital rights organizations that are participating in these IGF meetings or several other meetings. That how can we reach out to journalists and make it easier for them to understand? And part of what we've done, or what I've done as a journalist and what we've done as Bolo Bhi, is just simple FAQs at times to break down what this is, like what is ICANN, what does it do, why is this decision important, why is this meeting important. And oftentimes we see that sending that ahead of time to a reporter who does cover those issues, it sort of helps because they have this 10 or 20 FAQs to understand, okay, this is basic, I got it, I need to pick out. But those are not something that we can always promise, but definitely important. But I think that journalists being there at the meetings, having organizations that protect journalists like CPJ or work with journalists is really important, definitely, because you can then hopefully send that information out. But having journalists there is also really important, because I have an experience in journalism and I also do digital rights, I might take certain things for granted, or I might not pick up on certain things, but somebody who's not been involved in those processes will pick up on those things and those aspects much more than I would. And I think it's also important to involve journalists that don't necessarily write in digital spaces to attend those meetings, or to even be part and watch the live streams, or to have those documents, because they're the ones that are working with people on the ground, right? So they're able to pick on those issues and be like, hey, no, this will impact someone in Waziristan. Not being able to have access to the internet in Balochistan, or having internet blackouts in Balochistan, or in Waziristan, or in Egypt, or in Bahrain, or in Syria will impact people, because that's how I get my information. Hey, you can't block that, or you can't restrict that, or you cannot make it more expensive. We don't even talk about that much. It's not sexy enough to talk about or report on the fact that, if the internet is too expensive, what will you do? It's available, but it's too expensive, so you can't have it, essentially. So I think it's important for journalists to be able to do that. And I know it's sort of like we've opened up like an ideal list of things that should happen, but something to start with could work.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, but I think internet governance is one of, as I said before, is one of those things that is fairly boring but really important. It's very, very important, and that's also why I don't think we can expect journalists to kind of be on top of it all the time, but I do think the principal obligation does lie with the communities that are represented here, and human rights and development, democracy support, and media development. But I do think, as with any topic that could also be like healthcare or something else that's also very boring and very important, we need journalists also to explain it and to be the interpreters towards the broader public around why these issues are important and why they should be, But I think there's a shared responsibility there that falls on both of us. Yeah.
So it sounds like there really is kind of a consensus that, even if organizations that represent journalists need to be present, it really is beneficial to have at least some type of journalist presence and not depend just on the kind of advocacy organizations. Let's take 2 more questions. Chris?
So if Corinne could just clarify what she was alluding to. She mentioned people who attended some of these conferences, and she thought their suggestions might have been benign and done out of ignorance, but on reflection thinks that they're not. Are those gongos from certain countries you're alluding to? Just if you could comment on that. And then my question for any of the panelists who wants to take it up, you've all devoted a good deal of attention to the limitations and challenges that the multi-stakeholder model has, but there's a school of thought that suggests that over time, especially given the U.S. withdrawal from this position, that very powerful state interests that are deeply committed to a multilateral model will carry the day. For a whole host of reasons. They already have officials from their countries in key positions at the ITU and other such bodies. The stakes are enormous. The power that's at play is enormous. What is your degree of confidence that the multilateral model won't simply subsume the multi-stakeholder model?
Yeah, very quick question. It's like one more and then answer those.
Yes, just really need an education, and just how are all these organizations validated? Who writes their charters, and how are the people appointed? And how do they all get together for a common purpose? sort of strange to me. I wish you could help me on that.
Yeah, that's good. I think those two questions are somewhat related too, and in terms of thinking about how they're structured, but also what is their resilience going to be in terms of the multi-stakeholder model going forward. What do you guys think?
I mean, I think on the question you had, sir, whether the multi-stakeholder versus multilateral model, I certainly hope not, but I think that's part of the reason why we're here. I think that's why, in terms of internet governance, this is why this report is actually much more important than it and at first sight, but it is actually important because it raises the broader issue of it's really, really important that we get involved, not just for our immediate interest, but in order to let's say stave off that development and make sure that it doesn't get subsumed by governments who certainly do not have public interest goals at heart of freedom of expression, privacy, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, my faith. I don't really know how much I can say about that, but I think that's why it's important we're here. Yeah.
And I think on a similar note, we had the pleasure of being at the Ranking Digital Rights launch just before this. In a sense, I am not that concerned as such by the multilateral model subsuming the multi-stakeholder model, because I think a lot of the issues that at least I'm concerned about also stem from business power and from private power and the kind of decisions they're making. Whilst I think that the states still have a large role to play in internet governance, it's not the only concern. And that's why I sort of don't think that posing multilateralism against multi-stakeholderism in that sense, with one eating the other, is the biggest concern we have moving forward. I think who becomes the next major power player within multi-stakeholder governance, and that might very well be the private sector. And that raises a whole new host of questions about legitimacy and accountability, and some of the issues that the other sir addressed about what is their charter, what is their legitimacy. I wish I could go into all of that for the 5 different bodies, but they're very different, and the structures they've set up are very different. I'm happy to discuss that after the panel if that's of interest. And then to the question on malevolence versus stupidity, I think something that I'm very worried about is that Article 19 has recently put out a statement when we saw that there was a large American-based company working through ICANN together with the Chinese government to potentially implement technology that would allow for technology to be developed that would help implement national law in China, which has a lot of it for domain name registration, which has a huge impact on freedom of expression. And these are all things that these organizations, to a certain extent, willingly engage with that because they want access to the market. And I think that's something that we need to be worried about in terms of how these very boring technological decisions then end up having a huge impact, especially for internet users in China. So that's to that effect.
Great. Do we have a couple more questions from the audience? We'll go right here in front, and then Jonathan in the back. Yeah. And if you could please state your name and affiliation.
Hi, I'm Paris Wong, Voice America. So my question is kind of follow up with Chris' question. So I'm just gonna have more specific talking about the multilateral and then the players. Obviously, stakeholders. China have been hosting, I think, 2 or 3 times of the global or international internet conference, trying to set up all the new protocols and regulations. And also with the new technologies coming up, how internet is being evolving, we're seeing that they has invested a lot of investments on the quantum computers and quantum internet and the satellite communication and all the stuff. So I'm just wondering, what's your thoughts on the development of the internet in the future and the technology, while like a stakeholder like China, with their records on human rights and their mindset on the freedom of the press and the internet, is going to impact on what we are talking today? Thank you.
I'm Jonathan Levy with the Federal Communications Commission. This is a question for one or the other of the report authors. One substantive issue that was mentioned briefly in the report was algorithm accountability. And I was wondering if someone could provide a little bit of sort of substantive information about the type of proposals that are actually starting to be discussed in international fora, and sort of who's making them and who's opposing them. Anything would be welcome. Thank you.
Great. Does anyone want to tackle the China question again, in terms of the hardware that, obviously China produces a lot of the hardware that the global internet functions on, and the question is, if that's built in with these Chinese standards, how is that going to affect the rest of us, right?
I mean, I think it's interesting because this was also covered in the Ranking Digital Rights panel this morning. I think one of the things you have to realize is that, different countries have different cultural values, and that's something we increasingly run into as the internet becomes spread across the world. That being said, I think a lot of these companies are aware of the fact that if they want to do business in places where the standards are different, then they need to be able to accommodate for that. Article 19 very much works from the perspective of, we believe that we need to follow the Ruggie principles, so the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and that is like the minimum standard we want to see for hardware or other technology coming out of wherever, because that will ensure that people who use it will have the guarantee that their human rights are respected as they do it.
I was wondering, Sana, Pakistan and China have a close relationship in terms of the whole situation on the subcontinent, right? What's the situation there in terms of, does the Pakistani government kind of look towards Chinese technology as a counterpoint to?
So here, no, they don't look at Chinese technology as a counterpoint, but they do look at Chinese methods of censorship and surveillance, but mostly censorship. And here's what we do. We import all the regressive stuff from China, and then we export it to Bangladesh and Afghanistan. As in we adopt those policies, and when we adopt those policies, then Bangladesh is like, oh, that's what Pakistan's doing, so we'll do that, and that's what Afghanistan is doing, then we'll do that. And yeah, I cannot count the number of meetings that I've sat across where I've been given an example that you're talking about censorship being bad and surveillance being bad, and look, China is doing it, they're so great and they're doing so well, and we're like, no, that's not how it works. But yeah, there's a lot of influx of Chinese hardware, definitely. But I don't, as Corinne already mentioned, I think that that's the bare minimum, the UN principles of, and I think that I think right now companies are, especially companies that produce hardware, are more concerned about like meeting the market standards to be able to sell their hardware and compete with other companies that sell similar hardware, rather than building in structures that would make it easy. I mean, that's governments are already doing that, and other companies that are non-Chinese are also sort of working in that environment to enable that. So I would be more worried about companies that are not hardware, but companies that are hardware, that produce hardware and software for surveillance, and which are selling to countries with repressive regimes. And a lot of these companies are Chinese, but a lot of them are also based outside, like FinFisher is German and British, NetSweeper is Canadian. So all of that technology being exported to repressive countries or developing countries, or countries where there are no existing laws that protect privacy, and that are being used for massive surveillance, or that are being used for massive censorship and human rights exploitations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In response to the question about algorithms and algorithmic accountability, I think it's a really great one. It's one that I'm supremely interested in. And it's really a nascent discussion, and it's also come up again in more recent conversations about fake news and how this news is circulated and whether we're living in filter bubbles. In terms of, and maybe some of my panelists can jump in too, in terms of thinking about what possible solutions would be, I think we're still at the very initial stages of looking at that, whether that would be more transparency, that companies would have to be more transparent about their algorithms, or whether that would be that there would be a principle, a do no harm principle to algorithms, that they would need to have certain standards built into them in order to uphold human rights. Those are some of the things that have been talked about. I've proposed like an algorithm ombudsman for social media platforms like Facebook, someone that other people can trust, that can look at the algorithm but doesn't jeopardize Facebook's proprietary algorithm, which is essentially what makes them all of their money, right? Which is why they're so hesitant. And we included that because, and, I think one of the reasons we included that is because it is a real nascent conversation where there's still a lot of thinking that needs to be done around it, and something that I think that the media development community can, this is one of the things that Andreas was talking about. I think this is something where we can bring a different lens than what people are talking about already. So that would be the answer to that. Let's take one more round of questions, and then we will, obviously the panelists will be here, and if you want to approach them individually to talk about something, we'll be able to do that. So one more round right here.
And the lady in black, she's raised her hands.
Oh, good, yes. So two women, right? So this one right here, and then Grace, who's in the back.
Hi, my name is Dana Satr, and I'm an independent researcher. So my question is that in a country like Iran, let's say that with all the government apparatus and then heavy filtering, system, and on top of that, the Western and the world, sanctions on Iran, how could you engage the civil society? How could you have them to, get basically feedbacks from them, to support the internet governance? And
Yeah, great question. And then we'll take Grace's.
Hi, I'm Grace Abu Hamid with the Department of Commerce, and Global Partners Digital released a report earlier this week or last week with an assessment tool and a diagnostic tool for multi-stakeholder processes. And I was wondering, from your perspective and perhaps in the media development community, what you think are sort of more successful or easier to, more successful multi-stakeholder processes, or ones that are easier to participate in, and if they had a series of principles that they were assessing multi-stakeholder processes against, and some of them you mentioned today, but if there are some key elements that I think that, that you think would be interesting for assessments and sort of diagnostic.
Great questions. Yeah, so, first question is, how do you do multi-stakeholder governance when a lot of the people that we're trying to involve are in closed societies where it's very difficult for them to participate? What do you guys think about that? You work in a lot of kind of conflict situations. You mentioned Syria already. How can we have a Syria delegation at an internet governance forum?
Yeah, Iran is a good example. We don't work in Iran, and we haven't. We would love to, but it's a very tricky context, of course. But there is. I think that the first question is really that the priorities of civil society partners in a country like Iran, or certainly in a country like Syria, are not these priorities. Like, they're not. I think the first step is to say, what can we do in order to make this a priority issue for you, in order for you to actually want to engage? And I think that's because I think we should be careful to assume that we can get people on board from a local community or civil society in a given country without first having a sort of at least a general idea of what's on their agenda before we kind of, I think that there's a lot of what we're saying here is very well-meaning in terms of getting more diversity and inclusivity in multi-stakeholderism and internet governance, but it really needs I'm dodging the question incredibly, but
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I think what would be...
Here, could you wait for the mics just to make sure everybody... Yeah.
I think it's an excellent question, and especially because we're now thinking that we need to do supply-side economics. We need to show people, meet internet governance forums and get them there. But actually it's the other way around. There are issues of that people in China and Iran have that can be solved on internet governance level. So it's translating the problems that people have to the solution places on those fora. The internet governance is not a thing that we should continue forever because it's internet governance. No, internet governance helps us come up with solutions for real world problems that we have. So it's more like we should ask the people what problems they have, what they would like to address, how they would like to internet, and what they would like the internet in 20 years to be, and then see how we can address that on the application level, on the infrastructure level, and see how we can accommodate that. And that then depends whether we work on spectrum, on end-to-end encryption, on availability, on low bandwidth connections. And so there are a swath of issues, but just interrogating and asking people what they actually need, then that also keeps them motivated. Because it's been said a lot, it can be boring, but I've also never been in such an exciting place because the people there are extremely smart and it's extremely motivating to work therefore in internet governance. So it's finding problems that people want to solve. Because we have been in the media development community been focusing lately a lot on digital security. And so we've been training a lot of people on digital security, and everyone who has tried to train someone in digital security, or probably people who have tried to engage in digital security, know that it just doesn't work. Like, who here is an OpenPGP user? And who likes it? Very good. Continue. So we've seen a huge improvement with Signal. Right? And the fact that Signal works is because we managed to get a protocol working better that underlies that. But that's been building on XMPP and OTR and all other stuff we've been working on. So it is an incremental work that it's never done. It's a bazaar, it's a cathedral. It's something that we need to build together. And as said, the more people we have from Iran, from China, the better we will have that software and those solutions matching their needs and those problems, because we do not understand all the problems and the eyes of other people. So we might be more sensitized to freedom of expression and privacy issues, but there are also a lot of economic and social rights mediated by the internet that we also need to take into account in protocol development. So we also need to be educated by these people, and it's really ridiculous that the language of the internet is English. Like most of the content on the internet is English, but that's not only true on the content side, that's also true on the back-end side in programming languages. And what signal does this give to people who want to program on this global internet, right? It just says, you're a foreigner. This is not your place. So we need also to work on the internationalization of protocols. And that will probably really differentiate and change how it works. And we've made steps with internationalization of domain names, but the fact that you still cannot have non-Latin characters in an email, that's really ridiculous. So that is something super concrete we can work on. So internationalization, and some people will probably be really passionate about that. So it's not only security, privacy, but also internationalization, a lot of work on access, distribution. We see an increased number of centralization, not only with the Googles and the Apples on the application level, but also with the content distribution networks, also on the telcos, which means that we're creating new choke points on the internet for censorship, but also for pricing and affordable internet. So a lot of work and a lot of great and interesting angles for everyone to work on.
Right, thank you. And then what about the last question about diagnostics tools and kind of what, I think the question is broadly, like what multi-stakeholder processes are working and how can we potentially increase those, and then which ones are not, and where do we need more work?
Can I speak for a minute on the Iran?
Yeah,
question?
definitely,
Sorry.
sure.
So I can relate to it, not entirely, but in parts. And how do you get people from places, or how do you get government officials or involved in processes in places that are repressive, right? And one of the things that one of the set of things that have worked is like you need a foot in the door. So oftentimes, like Niels gave a long list of things that can be included, but we often, when we work on campaigns, we often tell our partners to be like, if they're even Article 19 or Access Now or EFF or others, that when you are issuing letters or a campaign about something that's happening in Pakistan, try to focus more on the economic impact of it and on the impact of Pakistan's international relations, and leave the argument about democracy and freedom of expression to us locals, because when even well-meaning organizations come and talk about freedom of expression is suddenly seen as sort of a Western concept, and all governments hear is, oh, insulting the Prophet, blasphemy, vulgarity, porn, and we're like, you know what? Like, it's not a Western concept. It isn't. So, what are things that can be the foot in the door? Could there be an economic argument where there could be an increased participation from Iran because there is an economic argument that's there? Can that be made simpler and easier and sent out to reporters so they can argue the economic aspect of it, about how Iran could be left out of the global scenario if that happens? Could it be anywhere about anything to do with economy, I think, and business works better with governments a lot. I don't think with Iran the international argument works. With Pakistan it does, because we rely heavily on aid. So those kind of arguments are really helpful, and I'm happy to talk offline as well about some of the tactics that we've used as well.
So the question of indicators for multi-stakeholder models, I think there's two essential things that you can look at. So accessibility and inclusivity, and those break down into different things. So for me, something that I run into even sitting in our London office is technology. A lot of these organizations don't meet on a monthly basis. They meet maybe every 3 or 4 months, or sometimes only once a year. And in the meantime, a lot of the discussions happen over calls or over mailing lists. And you need a pretty decent internet connection to keep up with the volume of emails that you will get. And just to be able to connect to an Adobe Connect room to have a conversation. So that's a huge thing. You need to have like the minimum technology to be able to participate, good Wi-Fi connections, and either a handheld or a computer. Money. That is still one of the big problems, is like, it's just very expensive to keep up with, all these different meetings, because they happen all over the globe, which in itself is an excellent thing, because that way you sort of share the burden of travel. But it does mean that it becomes very expensive if you want to participate in person. Now, luckily, this isn't always necessary, because most of these meetings have good connections if you want to participate remote, and they really facilitate that. Technical knowledge is another thing you could sort of use as an indicator, like how much background in technical engineering do you need, how much background do you need in business, how much background do you need in whatever else is being discussed at that point. I think culture is huge. A lot of these organizations come from very specific cultures, either academically or within technical engineering. That brings with it a whole set of behaviors that are more likely to be inclusive of some people than others. Language is one we mentioned before. It's really hard to participate if you don't have a good, if you don't speak English well. Access to all of the players and all of the documents. Now, luckily for instance, ICANN and the IETF, everything is online, including mailing lists, so you can find it really easily. It's not that difficult to reach out to people from different constituencies. But for instance, for the International Telecommunications Union, although it has gotten better over the years, still not all documents are available, and it's not as easy to participate in these fora if you're not a part of a national delegation, or if you don't work for a government. So these are all some examples of where I think you could do better on accessibility and inclusivity.
Okay, that was great. Great answer. I want to thank, I think we're going to wrap up now, and I want to thank my panelists, Corinne, Sana, Andreas, and Niels. It was really a pleasure to have this discussion. I thought it was a really lively one, and I feel like I learned a lot, which is great. Before we leave, I just want to plug 2 other CIMA reports that I think